giving some information about the conflict situation itself, what can we learn about that, and then what is the role of this individual in this situation.
And what was interesting for me listening to your talk was how, those of us who work on modernization and globalization in various disciplines with our scholarship, religion has become such a bad word in the last 10, 15, 20 years because of the rise of religious fundamentalism. So even though many of us, we practice various religious beliefs in our private lives, or we might have our own spiritualities, whatever they are, it's hard to talk about being religious in a public forum and not lose your credibility, because it's such, especially I'm talking especially about in South Asia, it's hard to say you're Hindu anymore without being connected to the Hindu fundamentalist party. So those of us who, we would rather say you belong to a certain other set of belief systems, whatever they are. You're an environmentalist or you're something. So your talk was interesting because, of course, religion is a very powerful thing, and it's a very modern way of organizing, just as it's been organizing people for years before. So it was nice to see that, the difference in perspective.
Right, absolutely. We were just talking with someone in the State Department a few weeks ago who was very interested in our book, and he said that the State Department has avoided religion as much as possible over the years, has been as secular as they can be, but now they're realizing that they can't. I mean, they absolutely cannot. They cannot ignore religion anymore. They have to take it into account. And some of I mentioned before that there's not a whole lot of information out there about the positive role that religion can play in conflict resolution. There's not a whole lot of scholarship out there. But the little that is emerging is also speaking to that whether or not you identify with being religious, it's still a huge social force, defining so much of what we do. And even though, for example, the U.S. is a secular country, nevertheless, our politicians, in their personal lives, they may be religious, and that will still, to a certain extent, define or shape some of the things that they do. I mean, it's whether we as a country define ourselves as religious or not, it still plays a significant role.
Is the relationship between these peacemakers who seem to be operating outside of what the official political positions on various areas of conflict might be, and the fact that I think we in general didn't know, for instance, about the two men working in Northern Ireland, and reflecting on how difficult it seems to be to have there be an acceptance of multiple layers of dialogue going on in any given situation. I mean, looking at how Nancy Pelosi was attacked for going to the Middle East recently, that there is such a that the investment in war and the powers that are in place that have a kind of war dividend seem to be driving a lot of what is the dialogue, when in fact there can be these more subterranean effects of these individuals talking. And I'm wondering what if you could maybe flesh out a little bit the tangled nature of official statecraft and some of the things that go on behind the scenes that can be powerful, and maybe even speak to the issue of peacemaking itself as something which is not necessarily held in high regard, or at least can be portrayed as something negative when war does seem to be all around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly official and unofficial diplomacy is very much interrelated. There's so many examples actually in this book. I'll just give you one other one. In our peacemaker in Sierra Leone, Alimami Kuroma, he is Christian, and what's very interesting about his story is that he has said that the civil war in Syria, religion didn't necessarily play a role in the civil war there, And in looking at the history of Sierra Leone, there's always been fairly good relations between Christians and Muslims. There's been a lot of intermarriage, people living side by side. That's never been an issue. And so he was actually able to use that as a platform to be active in peacemaking. Because there are these fairly good relations between the two religions, he mobilized religious leaders, Christians and Muslims, and formed, I don't remember what it's called, but basically a group of mediators who are religious leaders. And they were very active in bringing together the rebel groups and the government leaders, oftentimes for the first time, for face-to-face meetings. They were there as observers during the peace process. They were the ones who had credibility and a sense of authority even among the rebels and the government leaders. When the rebels and government leaders couldn't speak to each other, they were at least able to speak to through these religious leaders. So while this official diplomacy is taking place, in the back, they were kind of the bridge among the different groups. And then when it came time to actually draft agreements and sign, they took a step back and said, you know what, this is your role, but we're going to observe and just make sure that the process is okay. And that happens quite often with secular conflict resolution practitioners as well. But it's interesting to see the particular role that religious peacemakers can play because of that credibility that they often have in their communities.
Question. Some of these people are conflict resolution, and some, in the best way, seem to be also to initiate conflict in a certain way. For example, the person doing the schools in Afghanistan who had to keep it secret, and so there seems to be maybe a line between conflict resolution and doing this work that maybe is here, maybe I don't see, but I wonder how does the center see that? I mean, it's a difficult question. I don't know quite where the boundary is, and I'm asking how you see the boundary that way.
Well, do you mean that in the case of Sakina in Afghanistan, she could be instigating conflict in the? I'm
wondering if there's a policy of the institute.
I see.
Or if there's a judgment that we can't support everyone who's doing good, so we're going to support these people and not that. Or if somebody's working, a religious person is organizing destitute people in Guatemala, to take an example. Is that that's peacemaking to some extent, as I see it. How does the organization see that, and how does it deal with the conflict between? And it's a difficult question.
It is. It is a very difficult question. It's one that we must deal with every time there's a nomination cycle. At the Tannenbaum Center, we define peacemaking very broadly. So the official definition of peacemaking is more the official type of diplomacy, writing and drafting peace agreements and negotiating at a high level. But we define peacemaking very broadly to include social justice activism, for example, as well, because all of these initiatives, this type of work, feeds into creating this culture, this environment in which peace can be possible, in which peace can be sustainable. So that's what I mean. That's just where we start, in that someone can come in with a series of different types of activities, and it could still be considered peacemaking as far as we're concerned. Track 2 diplomacy. In terms of making a decision in who meets the criteria and not, it's always an extremely difficult situation, because oftentimes, this was certainly the case a few weeks ago when we just ended a nomination cycle. I mean, really, I would say the far majority of the people that we were looking at qualified. I mean, they were incredible, remarkable individuals doing great work who absolutely deserve this support. At the Tannenbaum Center, we just don't have the resources to support everyone, so we can only choose one. And that's actually why we work with our Program Advisory Council, who are coming